So welcome, everybody. It's again wonderful to have you here today. My name is Lynn Westwater, and I am professor of Italian at GW and co-director with Jamie Cohen Cole of the GW's Humanities Center. And we're really delighted today to have you here for this event that we've organized. I'm excited to be in conversation with Alexa Joubin, who is a professor, I think you all know, but is a professor of English at GW and a Humanities Center Fellow. She has a long list of publications, but I'll just mention her most recent book is titled Shakespeare and East Asia, which came out with Oxford in 2021. And since we have a lot to talk about today, I think we'll just dive right into our conversation, if that's okay with you, Alexa. Great. Yeah, so I wanted to start sort of in a larger frame by asking you, or talking about this issue with you of the fact that gender has emerged as a very powerful wedge issue lately. And very recently, we had Vladimir Putin using scaremongering about gender and sexual orientation to support his authoritarian agenda. In the midst of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when you would imagine he would have many other things to be thinking about, he took time to complain about cancel culture in the West, claiming that Western elites had canceled J.K. Rowling because she did not, quote, please fans of so-called gender freedoms. Putin was referring to Rowling's attacks on transgender rights. So why do you think that gender has become the latest battleground in the culture wars?
Thank you for this question. It's so highly relevant in our time as well. I would like to put out some content warnings for our audiences, whether you're dialing in or here with us on video. I may show some film clips later on, and in our discussion as well, we may touch on gender-based violence, foul language, as well as trans and gender trauma. So these are some of the potentially triggering themes that may be covered. So Putin and J.K. Rowling, at first blush, it may seem odd that Putin should care about Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, when in 2003, a group of Russian lawyers sued Warner Bros. Over similarities between Putin and the CGI character Dobby the Elf. Upon closer examination, Putin's and Rowling's obsession about gender purity is not odd at all. Right-wing politicians follow the same playbook. The pandemic of COVID has fueled intersectional forms of hatred and fear that have coalesced somehow around gender. Anti-feminist, white nationalist, trans misogynist, anti-immigrant, and homophobic movements, they all use the notion of genderism to evoke a range of disrupted identities. I believe we should see gender as a set of evolving interpersonal relationships. So it's not gender identity, but rather gender practice. So gender is a kind of social practice. It's not an immutable identity you check off like in a box on some kind of form. And interpersonal relationships of course, evolve in the presence of other people. And this kind of social practice, they will evolve over time. Nobody is the same or fixated in every point in time, right, in life. So in short, trans studies can put into focus and expand our collective understanding of human variations. Really, it really comes down to human variations. So I have more to say about the right wing and how the how Putin's remarks actually point to something deeper at a later point. How, for example, anti-Semitism is actually also connected to the current anti-trans and anti-abortion to some extent, all of these campaigns.
I was wondering why, or how you would explain why right-wing ideologies seem to be afraid of trans individuals.
Thank you. I was thinking about this a lot, and you know that the term people like to use, transphobia or homophobia. In a way, I think it's not ideal that we misappropriate medical terms. It's not a phobia, right? Phobia is a clinically defined condition. and we should not put the wrong pressure on people who actually suffer from those conditions. And of course, for the people who are anti-LGBT, they're not afraid. They hate people, right? So it's not fear but hatred. Those people who support patriarchal institutions, they like to police gender expressions. The trans activist and theorist Julia Serrano calls the phenomenon scapegoating of femininity. The patriarchy focuses its energy on guarding the superiority of masculinity. So this is some kind of violate the social order that you cannot violate. Trans feminine identity, in their eyes, devalues cis heterosexual masculinity by rejecting it. So the presence of trans individuals creates a category crisis for people like Putin, and in fact, Rowling as well, very unfortunately, in her Twitter comments. Trans people challenge putative binary distinctiveness of gender. It poses the transness poses what is known in social theory as distinctiveness threat. So distinctiveness threat refers to when a group sees the boundaries defining their identity as indispensable. They feel threatened when these boundaries are blurred. So gender identity is merely the latest scapegoat. There is a long history of associating trans bodies with illness and inversion of trans individuals' personal truth. I wanted to show, so I have a lot of film clips. Here is one. This is not a trans film at all, but it touches on gender and it's really interesting, especially voice. And this one will work even for those of you who are just listening in, like radio. So the film is called In a World.
This Wednesday, one woman will teach another woman to sound a little less retarded.
In a world like nothing you've ever imagined.
Without a single unified voice, humanity has been left searching for answers to the unknown. Now, one man has the power to change that. One man, me.
When the storm hit, both our cars were totally underwater.
In a world where both of our cars were totally underwater.
We thought it would take forever to get some help.
But a new wind was about to blow.
There's hundreds of people doing voice work, but only 5 of them are making all the money.
Yeah, that's as it should be. I'm sorry, as long as I'm one of the 5, that's as it should be.
She always lowers her voice when she does the voiceover for film trailers, for example, or for commercials. But the film is truly about how unconsciously gendered our voices are, how we respond to different kinds of voices. So voices are not just raised, but they are also gendered. And there's this popular belief that women have to lower their voice to sound, as the character told us, quote, less retarded, to be taken seriously. And I think this illustrates a lot of what I call cisgenderism that is pervasive in our life and in screen culture that sometimes we don't see, or in this case, we don't hear. You can see how in that short clip, the woman is talking, it's just something very mundane, right? A car broke down. But her husband in the back periodically turns it into something very serious, especially how he articulates and pronounces the word blow, about to blow. He has this particular way of saying it, and throughout the film, that character insists it has to be this low masculine voice to have authority, to attract people, to assure people. And that's just one example of even when a film doesn't bill itself as trans film, we can rethink it with trans theory and to understand gender variance, to understand the range of gender experience. So in a way, trans theory is not just about trans experience or trans individuals, but rather about how gender flows.
Thank you so much, Alexa. I remember seeing that movie, so it's interesting to have it put in this frame. So I wanted to get back to something that has come up already a couple of times about this, the idea of purity and notions of purity, be they racial or according to gender, being used by haters to attack human rights. So I was curious how you would sort of link those two issues.
Yeah, there is a racialized dimension of anti-trans attitudes historically. And anti-trans discrimination was linked in the earlier period actually to anti-Semitism, and both hinge on the idea of purity. So there's this famous German sexologist, Magnus Hirschfeld. He's a pioneer in trans studies. He coined the word transvestite, which is no longer in use today. He combined the Latin words for crossing and closing, trans and vesties. In 1910, he published a book entitled Transvestite, which regards gender nonconformity as an independent phenomenon from same-sex desires. So remember, in the early period, their struggle was to determine if gender and sexuality are two different things. So Dr. Hirschfeld observed that individuals who experienced a feeling of peace, security, and exaltation when in clothing of the other sex, he found that transvestites could be asexual, bisexual, or have any given sexual orientation. So Hirschfeld's conception of the transvestite overlaps in part with the modern day practice of drag and gender nonconforming sartorial choices. Hirschfeld's contribution lies in this distinction between transvestism and the conception of homosexuality. In his time, of course, homosexuality was pathologized, seen as a form of illness. And this rampant conflation of sexuality and gender expressions, homosexual individuals were thought to be gender inverted. And in fact, as feminism have taught us, some discrimination against women historically also built on this a form of inversion, colonial inversion of race. That's how gender and race is connected. As a pioneer in gender and sexuality studies, Hirschfeld unfortunately was persecuted by Nazis for his Jewish and gay identities. His Institut für Sexualwissenschaft was shut down in 1933. All the books were burned. This is a palpable and really vivid example of the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-trans attitudes. At the core of anti-Semitism and anti-trans discourses are the ideas of racial purity and gender purity, which of course leads to harmful biopolitics.
So in the trajectory that you're tracing, it seems that the 1990s were a turning point. Could you tease that out a little bit more for us?
They primarily were thinking in, of course, now outdated term, male to female transsexualism. Remember that such terms are quite ridiculous, and we shouldn't use male to female or female to male because, as activists point out, that's about as meaningful as saying heterosexual to homosexual or vice versa. Susan Stryker, a theorist, and Kate Brunstein, they were among the few voices in the 90s to correct the misconception. Feminist scholarship of this time deployed trans as a trope to solve some problems with the women question by using transsexualism as a way to identify gender's complex social articulation. And so, unfortunately, transness was not only misunderstood kind of very narrowly, they were only thinking of trans women, but also misappropriated for utilitarian purposes by theorists to serve as cis institutions. So there's a bit of uneasy relationship between queer studies and trans studies because of this, because activists see that you are just using us. More recent scholarship has begun to assess how transness is inherent in all identities and our current conception of gender. The pathologizing tendency remains, very unfortunately, because there are medical gatekeepers and then there are lawmakers. They they continue to see transgender individuals as being ill, as being incomplete or impure, as we said before. I co-wrote a book called Race, and in there, that's actually the genesis of this project, right? In studying race, I realized really race and gender are a bit of red herrings. They're there, but it's just a label people like to use to talk about social difference. It's a go-to place for haters as well.
So I'd love to hear more about why society uses why you think society uses marginalized social practices as metaphors for illness, and relatedly, why society inverts trans individuals' personal truths and accuses them of lying, quote unquote, and what we can do to sort of counter this legacy.
Research finds that truth actually often emerges at the border between fiction and fact, between personal and social truths, and all of these different truths are structured by narratives. That is why I think film and literature are so important. The inversion of trans individuals' truth, that's, of course, as I pointed out before, it's out of coming from a place of hate, and they're trying to in denying the trans individuals' empowered narratives. They think they can then assert or impose their version of the narrative and have that pass as truth. I think it's useful to think about some of the key terms, right? Cisgender, transgender, what do they mean and where do they come from? So again, this is 1990s. Biologist Anna DeForce was actually the first person. So she coined the word cisgender in a news group. The Latin root cis prefixes things that do not change property, which, as you understand, would be ridiculous, isn't it? We age, we move geographically, we go to different schools. So what do you mean human life just fixed and do not change property? So cisgender refers to, back then, quote, the condition of staying with birth assigned sex. And it's used as an oppositional idea to transgender. Despite the seeming binary oppositions, cis and trans, right? All gender practices, they actually evolve over time. And so I don't think they should be used. Some scholars are saying we shouldn't use these terms, not even the word trans, because you're just creating some binaries. I beg to differ. I think we should honor them because they're already in circulation. We can use them with more sensitivity, but we shouldn't just outright throw them out of the window. That wouldn't solve the problem. So for people who are against, they're saying, oh, when you say cis versus trans, you're implying that cisgender authorizes itself as the real, which has always already arrived. Trans can only be the practice that's always moving away, that's always deviant, right? I do assign flexibility to both terms, and I still use them in my writing because we need these words to critique sexism, to critique the sexism that has assumed cisgender status of all characters or all people or events. And we need these terms to impose, to deconstruct the sexism that impose identity categories on different social practices. Now, where does the word transgender come from? The old word, of course, was transvestite or transsexual, but Virginia Prince in 1987 coined the word transgender. Actually, she used transgenderist. It's now outdated. We don't use that anymore. Leslie Feinberg was then the first person to use the word transgender as one word, as an umbrella term. And then there are many theorists now. They all use this differently. Susan Stryker, one of the leaders of the field, uses the term to refer to those who do not conform to prevailing expectations about gender. Now that's really broad. That doesn't necessarily mean someone who has gender dysphoria, right? It's just whoever, maybe it can be a woman who wears shorter hair in a particular way because you don't conform to prevailing expectations. So it's a really wide kind of really broad usage. Some medievalists use the word trans or transgender to discuss not only movements across or between ideologies, but also people who are, quote, beyond gender, or without categorizable gender, connecting transness to ideas of transcendence. So you can see there are many, many different uses. When we say trans today, right, without the word gender, trans, we don't necessarily just mean the better known version of transitioning from A to B, like traveling from point A to point B, or in a different realm from A. It could also mean neither A or B, right? And I think that's really important. There are also people who use trans as a verb, like Jen Mannion. She uses trans as a verb. So the person or the character has transed gender, for example. So trans is no longer used as an identity, but like I said, I think more like social practices or the usage of it as a verb that really directs our attention to gender as evolving practices. So I think that's really important. And I hope this very quick snapshot of these two key terms are somehow helpful. There's an Oscar-winning film, A Fantastic Woman. It's really fantastic. What can I say? I highly recommend it if you're interested. Mirror is a really important trope. Not only do people discover themselves in mirrors or accidental mirrors as they walk down the street, you know, like the windows can serve as some kind of mirror. You look at yourself in there. For someone from the mainstream community, maybe they're just checking their hair. We'll see if they look good today. For our trans, oh, by the way, A Fantastic Woman, they actually cast an openly trans actress. That is very important in terms of trans inclusiveness. So mirror plays a very important role here. Take a quick look at this scene. In a lot of films that are not only feature surgery scenes, but also some kind of genitalia check to ascertain, as if anatomy has some kind of indexical value. Anatomy will tell us what the character are. So it's all about what you are. But here, it's a very empowering scene. Since this is a scene involving nudity, audiences may expect some kind of, quote, revelation. So the grand reveal is also a trope hurting trans characters in a lot of trans films, except it's very clever. There's a twist. Only is this a reversal of the cisgender masculinist gaze, but it also denies the film audience's voyeuristic desire. What you see is actually her face. That's who she is. This is a response to an earlier work in 1981 by Susan Orjanian called Self-Portrait. And so you can see how the film is paying homage to that from 2017. And just 1 year later, you have Django Jane. This is another film. You can see they're all doing the same pose and all using the mirror to look back at us, the voyeuristic film audiences. So suffice to say, there are so many different ways to represent minority communities, and they all have different implications. I invite you to use a trans lens to not just look at trans work, but also what we assume to be non-trans beforehand, and maybe we'll discover a lot of new things.
And I was wondering if you could give us some examples of cis-centric assumptions from your field of study.
So it's ironic, isn't it? Because as we know, Shakespeare's plays often feature cross-gender roles, especially the comedies. And professional performers in Shakespeare's times were all male actors, right? And boy actors perform female roles. Given this, it's ironic that Shakespeare studies now could have cisgender bias. Much ink has been spilled over theatrical genders of the boy actors and Shakespeare's female characters, but I feel like people were not asking the right questions. They do not see the boy actor's gender on a continuum. Stephen Orgle's famous book, Impersonations from the 1990s, has some methodological limitations typical of 1990s. He's commenting on Lady Mary Roth's play Urania, and he suggests that the stage transvestism works to insulate it from lustful feelings. So in other words, the boy actors do not have agency. They are there to prevent the audiences from lusting after the female character, so utilitarian. I think we should ask new questions. How might the narrative change if we consider the boy actors or some characters as transgender rather than ciscentric, quote, cross-dressing stories requiring suspension of disbelief? And I think that would really give the field new material to work with now that queer studies and feminism are very established fields.
Hi, Alexa. Thank you so much for this talk, which is so fascinating and so important. I was wondering if you could say more about boy actors, and I'm wondering if there's some way in which the boy actors might count as non-binary. I'm thinking about all of the references from the period to sort of, for the most part, boys and women are as cattle of the same color. And there's a lot of references to the idea that the boy actors aren't necessarily men and they're not necessarily women. And I wonder if the non-binary category, which is slightly different than the trans category, might also, I wonder how, if you could say a little about the intersection between those characters when it comes to what those young actor bodies are doing on the stage.
Yes, we should see them as non-binary, trans, or fluid. Simon Chess' work, she's a pioneer. She's pointed out that boy actors, when they grow up to become adult actors, a lot of them carry what she calls trans residue. They don't necessarily play female roles anymore, but they carry this trans residue into their life. Much more research needs to be done on this area. Chess, I believe, is the only one who's written a book and some articles on it. We are just getting started. There are few people in trans early modern studies. If we see the boy actors as non-binary, as trans, as fluid, the final scene of As You Like It is can be a charade of Rosalind's male alter ego, Ganymede. We can abandon our literal mindedness about dramatic fiction and then consider the character's practice in fluid terms. It's no longer just a male adolescent actor portraying an adult female role, right? We should recognize transgender performance as resisting the binaries usually understood to structure modern gender. And so people sometimes say to me, well, trans theory, you are being ahistorical because you impose this on early modern stories. But actually, not to do that, I think, would be ahistorical, because we would be unconsciously imposing modern structures of gender onto what is going on in Shakespeare's play. So instead of asking, why did the English stage take boys for women? I think that's a wrong question. Instead of asking that, we should ask about the ciscentric formulation of that question itself. Did the early moderns, did Shakespeare, would they have asked such a question? If not, are we not being ahistorical because we're imposing all this? So the body of the female character and the boy actor's somatic presence, maybe all of this exists on a continuum rather than in contrary fixations, like here is a boy playing a woman. I'm sure in the fluid world of early modern theatrical world, it did not work that way. My specialization is in modern imaginations of the early modern world, like in films and adaptations. So that's another layer, another trans-historical layer. But thank you, Tanya, for this question.
See Adams
Yeah.
questions. So he says, can you speak about the concept of acting transness in both on screen and real life? I'm thinking of Judith Butler in that context. The question in itself might be a bit ciscentric.
The performing arts, I think, are an important tool for tackling cisgenderism, given the art's power of embodied representations. So you are right, acting transness on screen could make people become more aware of the artifice of gender, right? Because it's acting. But then in real life, if we talk about performance, I think it's slightly risky. I want to recognize that both cis and trans practices can be performative in different contexts, right? So it's not just performing transness. What if we are performing normative gender roles? Why is the concept of performativity dangerous? Because detractors often accuse trans people of performing to, quote, pass as someone else that they are not, to deceive the society, or to gain access to the wrong restroom, hence all the legislation about bathrooms. If trans individuals are performing roles at all, it is either a cisgender conforming role enforced by the society or some form of trans narrative deemed acceptable by medical gatekeepers. It's not a happy situation, as you can imagine, between a hard and a very hard place, between a rock and a very hard place, and no matter what they do, they're screwed. Trans individuals have to perform in this sense and these contexts in order to survive. On one hand, the notion of performative gender expression can liberate society from biological essentialism. But on the other hand, the performativity has been misappropriated by anti-trans groups to invalidate trans life. And that's why trans activists really resist that notion. It's a double-edged sword.
Thank you so much for this. This has been really great. I am just curious, especially in light of what you just said, and how bringing more awareness to people through the arts. Kind of, what is your perspective on representation in the trans community for children and adolescents? Because a lot of times when we do see that representation, it's in the adult community.
Yes, there are so many new documentaries out. I would recommend one called Always Jen, and that is a documentary of a pre-adolescent trans person with her parents' approval. It's quite well done, and I think it accurately captures a child's perspective in terms of both the lack of adult trauma, but also a struggle to understand why there's so much bias against trans individuals, especially trans children. It's quite a moving documentary. In terms of screen culture, in terms of television and film, I haven't found that many narratives, whether it's inspired by true story or it's a fictional, that feature child protagonist. Most of them are adults or young adults.
Sorry, Alexa, just for those who aren't reading the chat, that there's a tween trans character in HBO's recent series, And Just Like That, that Lisa mentioned to us. Thank you.
Yes.
So Alexa, thank you so much for this conversation.